So you're sitting in your office looking at your computer, and you think to yourself, that computer is black. And then you think to yourself, that computer is my computer. And then you think to yourself, that computer is in front of me. In each case, it seems that what you see justifies what you judge. But what exactly is the relationship between what you judge and what you see? Now, it seems pretty clear that when you judge that the computer is your computer, your judgment in some sense takes you beyond what you see. It's not as if your computer has some distinctive look that you can make out. Rather, it's on the basis of some background knowledge that you identify the computer you see as your computer. Some philosophers might think that it's a computer isn't part of what you see. The concept computer isn't really part of the content of experience either. But what I want to focus on here is the self-locating judgment, the judgment that the computer is in front of you. Is the self-locating content of that judgment matched by some self-locating content within perception itself? Now, some philosophers have said things that suggest that they think that self-locating content can be equally a part of visual experience and judgments of one's own location. For example, Qasim Qassam writes in Self and Worlds that, quote, in egocentric spatial perception, the objects of perception are experienced as standing in spatial relations to the perceiver. He continues saying that such perception, quote, can therefore be described as self-locating. In experiencing objects as spatially related to one literally experiences the bodily self as located in the perceived world. And again, in Being Known, Christopher Peacock imagines, quote, the everyday case in which an ordinary person forms a belief with the content, I am in front of a door, for the reason that he sees a door ahead of him. Peacock writes, his visual experience represents the door as bearing a certain spatial relation to him. This is so even if he cannot see or otherwise experience his own body on this particular occasion. It would still be true that taking his experience at face value, he would judge that he is in front of a door. So Qassam and Peacock are saying that your judgment that the computer is in front of you is like your judgment that it's black rather than like your judgment that it's yours. That's to say, in making this judgment, not only do you base it on what you see, but you don't go at all beyond the content of your visual experience itself. And in saying that, they're assuming something substantial about the nature of visual experience, which of course they make explicit, namely that visual experience is self-locating. So call this view of visual experience the self-location thesis. That's to say, the self-location thesis says that visual experience can represent your location, even when your body is entirely out of view. The purpose of this paper is to defend this thesis against some objections. Now, one philosopher who seems to regard the self-location thesis as almost incoherent is John Perry. John Perry imagines seeing a cup of coffee and reaching to pick it up, and he notes that in this case what he sees guides the way he acts. But then Perry asks, how can this be? I am not in the field of vision. No component of my visual experience is a perception of me. How, then, can this experience provide me with information about how objects are related to me? Perry seems to be assuming, in other words, that it's only if my body is in view that I can perceive the spatial relations of things to myself. Similarly, in Reference and Consciousness, John Campbell argues that in stating the spatial content of visual experience, we need to draw a distinction between what he calls relational and monadic egocentric spatial notions. So examples of relational egocentric notions are, for example, he's sitting on my left, the chasm yawned before him, look behind you, the computer is in front of me. In these cases, you specify the person with reference to whom the direction is being given. By contrast, monadic spatial notions don't state relations, but basically just state spatial properties. So, for example, x is to the right, x is below, and so on. And Campbell's claim is that to state the spatial content of vision, we don't need relational notions, but only monadic ones. He says we don't need the general conception of some things being to the right or left of an arbitrary subject. Ordinary human vision represents things as to the right or above, using only the monadic egocentric notions rather than the relational terms. So the position that Campbell and Perry are arguing for involves rejecting the self-location thesis, and I'm going to call it the minimal view. That's to say, the minimal view says that at least in cases where the perceiver's body is out of view, perception doesn't represent the spatial relations between other things and oneself, but rather just represents those things as bearing some locations in space. That's not to say that it can't justify judgments of where one is, but it doesn't do it by having any self-locating content of its own. So how do we decide which of these views is right? Consider again the case where you judge that there's a computer in front of you. According to the self-location thesis, this is, or at least could be, because you see that there's a computer in front of you in the same sense that you see that it's black. But according to the minimal view, we can describe your experience in a different way. Rather, what you see is just that there's a computer in front, or that there's a computer there. And that experience justifies your judgment that it's in front of you, but not by having that content. And if we agree that it's best to give the most minimal sorts of descriptions of experience we can, then we might think that so far the minimal view is well grounded. But now consider a different sort of case, namely that of what the ecological psychologist James J. Gibson called visual kinesthesis. Gibson described the following sorts of cases. Student pilots see where they are going on the basis of a visual invariant and get better with practice. Drivers of cars see where they are going if they pay attention. Viewers of a cinerama screen see where they are going in the represented environment. Gibson concludes, the doctrine that vision is exteroceptive, that it obtains external information only, is simply false. Vision obtains information about both the environment and the self. So how can the minimal view account for the kinds of cases that Gibson is describing? Let's consider one of them, namely the illusion of vection produced by a rotating optokinetic drum. Concerning such an experiment, Stephen Palmer writes that when a drum that you're inside of that has vertical stripes begins to rotate, you perceive the drum as stationary and yourself as spinning the opposite direction inside it. This experience of self-rotation is so compelling that many people become dizzy and nauseated, very much as if they were actually rotating, even though in fact they're stationary. But now, no one who holds the minimal view can describe the experience of vection in this way, because according to them, vision has no self-locating content, and so it can't also have as part of its content the motion of the self. So how are they going to describe it instead? Well, one thought might be that they can say that instead of experiencing yourself as moving from left to right, things that were once on the right are now on the left. But this sort of account won't do, since it fails to distinguish the case where there's the illusory experience from the one where you experience the motion of the cylinder veridically for what it is. Each of them fits the description equally well, and as Palmer notes, at the onset of the illusion, there's a vivid gestalt shift from the one sort of experience to the other. So something more needs to be said about the illusory experience to explain how it differs from the veridical one. Well, here's another possibility. We might say that in the illusory case, unlike the veridical case, not only is what was to the right and then to the center, now to the left, and so on, but in addition, the cylinder appears to be stationary, whereas in the veridical case, it appeared to be moving. And this is certainly a visual difference between the two experiences. But this doesn't seem to be all there is to say about the difference between them. For in addition to the non-motion of the cylinder in the illusory case, there's also an aspect of apparent motion in the illusory case that's missing from the veridical one. And this is what the subject points to when the subject says, "It seems that I am moving." But until we've identified what this apparent motion is, or is the motion of, we haven't explained all the ways that the two experiences differ from one another. So now my contention is that it's only by attributing self-locating content, specifically content involving the motion of the self, that we can explain the differences between pairs of experiences like these, and that we can explain what's distinctive about, say, the experience of driving in a car down the road, as opposed to having the world whiz by one as one sits in the car without it moving. Of course, arguing for this position at full length, defending it against all the kinds of objections I know you have, takes a lot of work. That's the work of the paper. You're welcome to read that. Thanks.